Anybody in here heard of dynamic symmetry? Good. This is good. After tonight, you'll have to excuse me. I 3 weeks ago had some major surgery on my jaw. The legacy of an accident, a freak accident I was in 2 decades ago, and it had some lasting consequences. And I finally bit the bullet and had everything fixed. But now I've got a metal bar in my mouth holding everything for the next 4 months. So I'm not able to articulate, but I'm retraining myself. Last week I was with a client and we were outside her house and we were walking around, and I was pointing out to her, I said, Mrs. So-and-so, you've got structural issues on your house. But I've retrained my tongue, so now I can say structural, which is an important word in my vocabulary. So anyways, if every once in a while I start sounding kind of strange, that's why. And there's a hell of a story behind the accident, but we'll save that for another time. How many of you know what a fractal is, more or less? Good, okay. The idea of self-similarity, the idea that a part of any composition, whether this could be a work of art, it could be a work of biology, it could be a work of architecture or a work of music, or it could be something in the astronomical level, the molecular level, but the idea is that there's a whole composed of parts, and there's a very unique resonant quality between the whole and the part. And this has been one of the animating principles of sacred art and sacred architecture basically since recorded history began. And we find the concepts and the techniques spread pretty much throughout the world. This idea that there is a special relationship between the part and the whole, and also the idea that that's not just between the part and the whole, but that whole is in turn a part of something even greater. So that idea of sacred art, particularly sacred architecture, was that you had a structure or a pattern that could act as an intermediary between the human scale and a much larger scale. Because one of the things that the archaic peoples really sought to do was to establish this connection with the cosmos. And we find this embedded in their architecture everywhere, which basically would start out by placing a line on the earth, and that line was described by the motions of the heavenly bodies above. And if that line then was dictated by the patterns of the cosmos, and there was something built along that line, whether it was a temple or even an urban complex, or even just a roadway between two sacred sites of pilgrimage, that pathway would then serve to link with a pathway in the sky, in the celestial realm. And so we find that there are examples of temples and temple complexes built that mimic the patterns we already find in the sky. And this is not accidental. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show, let's see, I think this would be the one we want here. I'm going to give you a geometry lesson, and like I said, it starts with just a line. And usually you would have chord stretchers that you find pretty much the same techniques repeated over and over again in different cultures. You have a chord stretcher. You establish a sacred center, and usually this was done by a geomancer or somebody who had the ability to detect the, maybe we could shut that door, possibly, since I'm not my mic. Hello? Oh, I am mic. Where's my, I did bring my stick in case anybody got unruly. Is my stick down there? It's, oh, here's my stick. Okay. I feel better now. I have my stick. See, this can be somebody, or if I see somebody back there sleeping. Okay. So you start with a line. Now you got to picture that this could be a line on a piece of paper, or it could be a chord stretched from a sacred center to some point, usually on the horizon. And what they were after was finding significant points on the horizon, which could usually be, it could be the rising or setting point of the sun at an auspicious time of year, such as the solstices or the equinoxes. It could be the rising or setting of the moon during its 18.6-year swing between the maximum and minimum, or it could be the rising and setting of a star or a star cluster, such as the Pleiades, or the dog star, Sirius, or several other stars that were often chosen for whatever the purpose was. So you picture you've got this sacred center and you stretch the line, and that line marks the position on the horizon where this event is happening that you want to memorialize in this structure, right? You stretch the chords. Now, that gives you the basis for developing all kinds of geometry. And generally, the next thing that was done is once you had the sacred center, once you had that post or pole or gnomon or obelisk or whatever in the ground, something vertical, you stretch the line and you can now draw a circle. Now, if you're doing this on paper, of course, you're using a compass, and I think I do have a compass I brought to show. We may get with, if you're interested in a really beautiful handmade, very functional compass, which we designed and Cameron sells on the website, it would be in the computer there. So we'll find it afterwards, and if anybody's interested, we'll show them. But you all know what a compass is, right? The drawing compass, like that Keith was talking about earlier. Okay, so this could be, you have an unmarked straight edge generally in the old schools, the Pythagorean schools, and the Platonic lodges. Oh, there we go. There we go. There's one right there. It's right here. So we make these because we couldn't find anything that was really suitable for our purposes. And this, whenever I do classes, we always use these compasses. You can see it works real nice with a bulldog clip. You can clip a, you can clip a gel pen in there, or any kind of pen you want, obviously, and you can draw circles with it. We can also make them very big. But this is generally a good size for just drawing up, typically on an artist pad or an easel. And so with these two implements right here, you'll see that you can create almost an infinitely complex world of patterns. And that's what they did. They knew these fundamental principles by which they could start with something very simple and then get into something very complex. So the first thing we do is we draw two circles of the same radius. So you picture this. Always, when you're dealing with geometry, keep your numbers as simple as possible. So, like, if this is a circle here, you know a radius would be from here up to the circumference, or from here to here. What you can see in this particular drawing is that you have two circles of equal radii and they overlap. And this overlap, you see, would be very simple to do. Once you've got your line, you draw one circle, and you simply move your compass over to the circumference of that circle, and you draw a second circle. And you get this figure called the vesica pistis, or vessel of the fish, which is a very universally recognized symbol as having very sacred or special properties. From that, you can begin to develop a whole language of geometry. Things I'll point out to you. If this is one unit, now this could be any unit you want. It could be a foot, it could be a centimeter, a meter, it could be a mile. It could be a yard, it could be a furlong. If this is one unit, then what's the entire width? I know, I'm requiring you to think now. 3, obviously, right? Now, but what is this distance? See, that's the interesting thing. If I put a rhombus in there, this rhombus has very special properties. First of all, it's composed of 2 equilateral triangles. So whatever the proportion geometry of an equilateral triangle are, you'll find it built into this particular figure right here. Now I should mention that the curved lines are generally particular in like in Gnostic Christianity and others. In the Hindu religion, you find this, the idea that the vesica, or a very similar shaped idea, is actually an image of the divine feminine, and is actually thought of as being a sort of a universal womb. And which is really, to me, as a geometrician, a very interesting way to think of it, because it's no exaggeration to say that the entire edifice of geometry emerges out of the vesica. Now you'll notice one of the things we've done here is by putting these, and you know these are equilateral triangles, right? Because an equilateral triangle means that all the sides of the triangle are equal, right? Equilateral. We know that this is 1 unit. We know that this is 1 unit because it's a radius of the same circle. We know that this is 1 unit because it's a radius of a circle equal to the other one. So therefore, simple geometric logic, we know that we're looking at an equilateral triangle. All three sides are equal, right? So we have here now a 60-degree angle. And if I do that, we now have a 90-degree angle. And we have some interesting triangles created in the process. I can tell you right now, without necessarily going through the math, that you can calculate this, and you find out that if this is 1 unit, this is 1.732 ... What does that mean? That means that the number keeps going without ever repeating. You know what the number pi, right? 3.14159 ... means that it just keeps going and never terminates and never repeats. If I establish this is 1 unit, that vertical axis is one of those irrational numbers that cannot be expressed by a whole number, 1.732 something. The interesting thing about that is if you take that number, which is irrational, and goes on forever and ever and ever without terminating, without repeating, and then you multiply it times itself, you get 3. What did you thought it was going to be more complicated than that. And of course, then by simple geometric steps, we can superimpose a square on there. We can add another circle. We can add more circles. And we find we can get a nice hexagon in there. And you know, a hexagon is composed of 6 equilateral triangles, isn't it? Now, by what used to be a secret process, I'm now revealing it here because it's actually already been revealed. So if you wanted to go dig this up on your own, you could find it. But once you set out these 3 circles, and you've got this basically, here's the way geometry works, especially this kind of geometry. When you do something, things will appear. Points, intersections will appear, right? Once you get those, you can use those to go to the next generation of the pattern. You see what I'm saying? In other words, at each stage, the potency is there to go further to the next stage. So that's what I've done here. I'm going to back out. We're going from here. I'm taking away 2 circles, leaving it to 3, and then I'm using this point and that point, right? So I project this point from here, and I use my straight edge to project that onto the circumference of the circle. I do the same thing here, and I get that point. Now, with those 2 points, I can go the next step, which is a pentagon. And you see, all I have to then do is, since pentagon is one of the regular polygons, right? So all sides are the same length. So I've already got this length here, don't I? Right? So I use my compass, and I strike an arc. I put my center here, and I strike an arc up there. From the center there, I strike an arc, and it gives me the 5th corner of that pentagon. So there's the basic shapes. The alphabet, the simplest version of the alphabet.
Someone's talking up in the audience.
Right here. The circle, equilateral triangle, a square, and a pentagon. If you notice, the idea that the regular polygons, because all the sides of each one are the same length, right? Now let's just go do that. This right here is, again, a universal symbol, and it can represent multiple things, right? It can be an image that represents time, or it can be an image that represents space, right? If it's space, what do we got? What space order can we put here? Well, north, south, east, and west, obviously, right? So if you were to lay out your line, let's go back to this. We're building a sacred temple. We lay out a line, right? Now we want to get a line that's perpendicular to that. Well, I just showed you how you get that perpendicular. You use the vesica. So you lay out 2 circles. You can then get a secondary line that's perpendicular to your first line, right? Now you use that crossing as a center. You draw a circle, and now you've got this universal symbol of time and space. How else can it be associated with time? Well, obviously, right? Think about this: 2 equinoxes and 2 solstices. Also during the day, dawn, dusk, midnight, and high noon. So you can attribute each of these things because those are natural quadratures of the circle that nature has given us, right? There's a natural right angle set down, right? Now from that, I can begin to generate more geometries. I can close that. So now we have an inscribed circle. Now, if I take the diagonal of a square, something interesting happens. I told you that the square root of 3, which I introduced you to before, 1.732, that you square it, you get 3, and it's an irrational number, meaning that the number goes on and on without terminating, without repeating. When you take the diagonal of a square, this was one of the most, right here, was one of the most common relationships used in sacred art and architecture, was this square and its diagonal. I've shown you simple techniques that if you were to try to duplicate that, like what I just showed you, would be how you could generate a square. There are multiple ways to generate squares, but we'll see several of them. But in this case, I've drawn a square and I've got its diagonal in it. When I put another diagonal in, what happens? I have a point that appears. I have a crossing point right there, which I can now use as a center, and that gives me the inscribed circle inside the square, which has typically been a symbol. Oftentimes you'll know that if you ever studied astrology, you know that the circle with the cross in it is a symbol for the earth. And it's an appropriate symbol for that, because the thing is when you're going to lay out a sacred temple, the first thing you do is you lay out this cross on the earth to point to the cardinal direction. And even if you're not building the temple oriented precisely to those cardinal directions, you're still acutely aware of them and how much you're deviating, because the deviation is significant, symbolically significant. And oftentimes the deviation is because you're pointing to a star or one of the solstices. Typically, solstices.
So
You know,
directing
if
to the
you
camera.
go out and you look at the horizon, east or west, on the solstices, or you do this, and this is something I highly recommend to people who get into a habit of doing, is to start watching the position of the sun on the horizon when it's rising and setting. Okay, so let's see, so this is our west, this is to the west, this direction, that's to the east. So if you're looking at the sun setting, let's say over the city of Atlanta, what you'll notice is that on spring equinox, it sets due west. Like, so any street that's oriented east-west, the sun will be setting. You probably notice sometimes around equinox when you're driving, you suddenly discover that the sun is straight in your face, right? Usually that's because you're going to be driving on an east-west street. Okay, now watch the sun, and through the course of the next 3 months, what you're going to do, if you're looking at spring equinox, what's happening is the sun is migrating along that horizon towards the north. And then it reaches its standstill position, its solstice position, when it's far north as it's going to get. It stands there for a few days, right? It hesitates right there, and then it starts coming back again. And then you'll get to fall equinox. It's going to be standing due east, due west again at sunset. Reverse all of this for sunrise, and then it's going to continue to migrate, and it's going to get down there about 80-some degrees south. It's going to be way standing down there in the south come winter solstice, right? And those are going to be the shortest days of the year, because the sun now is low. It rises and sets far to the south, and then it's low in the sky because of the tilt of the Earth's axis. Now that tilt was oftentimes a major part of laying out the pattern, the template on the ground that these builders would employ in order to lay out the ground plans of their temples. So now, notice here, you have a circle divided into how many equal parts? 8 parts. So therefore you have the eightfold division of a circle, and the means to create an octagon. Let's put another diagonal in. Now, what I've done here is the beginning of a whole interesting sequence of geometric progressions. Picture this. Once I have my square, I take the diagonal, right? And I swing that diagonal down, and I project the base of my square out until it meets the arc. You picture what I'm talking about there? And I do that on both sides. So what I've done is I've taken the diagonal of the square, and I projected it on the base and on the top of the square. And then I'm creating the rectangle. Now, I might mention that if you think of a square, and we always make these as simple as possible, the square is 1 unit by 1 unit, let's say, right? hopefully you all remember the Pythagorean theorem, right? There's going to be a short quiz afterwards, so we'll be testing you on this. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. The sides of any the two sides of any right angle triangle squared equals the square drawn on the hypotenuse, right? So you square the two sides, you add them together, you get the square of the hypotenuse, and then you get the square root of that, and it gives you the length of the other side. And here's an interesting and very simple mathematical exercise for you. If you have a triangle, a square, whose two sides are 1 unit, let's go back to this guy right here. Okay, 1 and 1. Look at this right triangle right here, right? 1 and 1. So 1 squared is 1 times 1, which is 1. 1 and 1 is 2, right? So now we're not looking for 2 because 2 would be a square drawn on that hypotenuse. What we want is that side length. So we take the square root of 2. And the square root of 2, interestingly, is another one of those irrational numbers. 1.4, 1.14, 159, 26, 79, dot, I forgot the rest. At one time had it memorized out to 7,642 places, but no, I'm not really. I had it memorized, I think, to 7 places. Look, I've got to save some of that space up there for important stuff. I figure, for practical purposes, any one of these numbers that I'm about to show you, round off to the 3 points. That means, like, the square root of 3. 1.732, the next number in the sequence happens to be 0. So if you go 7.132, or 132, and the next number is 0, you've got tenths in the first place, hundredths, thousandths in the third, 10 thousandths. So for most work that we would do on the human scale, we don't need to go beyond 1 part in 1,000 of accuracy, right? In fact, most of the time, 1 part in 100 is going to be enough, right? For real exacting work, you might be getting up there to those kind of like machine level precisions, but obviously for a work of art or craft, of building a house or building a temple or creating a painting or whatever, that level of precision is not necessary. Well, what we've done is we've created what I call a root 2 rectangle, and the reason is, if we always in these, we'll keep the short side unity, 1, right? Long side is now square root of 2. So you know that the long side of this rectangle has the property that its length is the same as the diagonal of the original square. Now if I take that rectangle and I put 2 diagonals in it, I can do something else, which is very interesting. Let's look what I did. I took, I don't know why this is so big on the screen, but I put in a diagonal in the root 2 rectangle. Now before I go forward, let's think about this. This is 1, this is the square root of 2, right? 1 squared is still 1, we don't need to think about that anymore. Square root of 2 squared is just 2, right? So we add 2 to 1 and we get 3. What that means is this diagonal is the square root of 3. 1.732, dot. So we found it showed up in a second way. See, we showed that it's the relationship of the length to the width of that vesicle, right? So it's a very important number that shows up in a lot of different ways, right? Now we discover it's the diagonal length of the root 2 rectangle. If I put another diagonal in there, let's see where we can go with this now. What I'm doing here is I am erecting a perpendicular to that diagonal. Now, I haven't shown you this, but there's 3 very simple techniques for erecting perpendicular lines using this thing here, right? And basically, perpendicular lines, you're talking about this, and then you're talking about 90 degrees, right? I could actually, I think, pull up another one and show you this right here. I will segue off to the side for a second, because this is going to tie right back into what I'm talking about, and you can really begin to see the whole sequence here. Here we're back to our line. Now, oftentimes when you've got a line and you're going to build something on that line, you're going to want the key points of the lines typically are the 2 endpoints of the center. Now, once you know what the golden section is, the divine proportion, that becomes a very significant point of dividing that line, but also the square root of 2 and the square root of 3 give you important points, which you'll understand short. But I'm just starting with 1 point at the end of that line. And then I'm almost at random, but not quite at random. I'm going to drop a second point. And you'll see that this is an exercise because what I'm doing is, you got a picture, this can be done on a site. Like you're trying to lay out a temple, right? And you need to set out these two right angles. You need to create a right angle. So you need the perpendicular line. This is not going to work if I put this dot down here or out there or up here. It needs to be somewhere around the middle or a third, and not too far up. Because what you're going to do is, once you set that random dot there, you're going to use this as the radius of a circle that you're about to draw. So that you connect those, the 2 points define the radius of a circle. The intersection of the circle with the line generates a third point. Remember what I said? Each step in the process creates the potentiality for the next step. So I'm using this as a center, and I'm using this now as a radius, and I'm going to draw a circle. And as soon as I've done that, I've given myself another point to work with. You see that? I connect that. Now, because all radii of the same circle are equal, which is really the first axiom of, or the first proposition of Euclidean geometry, we know that these two are equal. Whatever the length, they're equal to each other, aren't they? Now, I'm now going to use this, and I'm going to do a projection. So I take my straight edge, and I will do a projection out like this to get another point on the circle. So I get that. Now that's the magic point we're looking for. Because once I connect that back with my original point, guess what I have? A right angle. Now, once I've got the right angle, I don't need all of this. What I've done up to this point is just like scaffolding on a building project. It's something that's there temporarily, and then when you're done with it, you take it away. It's not part of the final building. So here I'm showing just to get the technique to work. I don't even need the whole circle, do I? I just need to get this point and that point up there. In fact, I don't even need that much. All I need is just that and that. But I know that when I'm doing that, that circle is there, right? And that's why this works. So now I've got a right angle. And I have taken this. I'm going to lay out a square on it. So what I could do is once I have the right angle, I can lay out that square any size I want, any convenient size, right? I could lay out and mark off a square this big, this big, this big, doesn't matter. Since this is here, I'm going to use that, right? And I've created a mark, and I've got an equal mark up there. So this distance here is equal. I use those two as centers, here to here, and I open my compass to that, and I swing an arc up here, and an arc this way. So what I then end up with is that. There's my square. And we'll clean it up, we'll put in the diagonals, and there's the simple math. There's the square root of 2, 1.4. If you're using this, for most people in an artistic application, 1.4 is going to be close enough, right? If you're laying out a canvas and you're using this proportion, because really in art, a lot of times the idea is not to stick slavishly to the numbers, right? You use the numbers kind of as guidelines to get an overall composition. But let's go with this. Now there's our square, the point in the middle that we've gotten. So project the point from that middle to the center of the side of the square. I can now begin to do a series of nested squares. You see what I've got there? I've got a square inside the circle and a square outside the circle. Now notice this. The square here, this circle, has the same diameter as the side of the square. This square here is side length much smaller. What is that ratio between the two? Well, it's the square root of 2. And we can do a whole series of nested circles. So you've got this circle, whatever this is, this circle, you're going to take this radius. If you multiply it times the square root of 2, you get this radius. Now, you can obviously draw this without actually even knowing the numbers.
Sorry,
right?
Lou.
You don't need to know the numbers, but it helps. If you get into this and start using
I know that feeling.
system, you'll see that it really does help. And you can begin to project lines, and those lines will give you points to give you further generations of the pattern. So here's a simple square. We're calling the side length 1. We've got A, B, C, D. We're naming the corners. Put in the diagonal. This is going to be old stuff to you now. Here's 1.4, the square root of 2. We projected it down. We're going to create the root 2 rectangle. We do both operations. We get that. And then from there we get the root 2 rectangle. And we can put in there the diagonal. With that diagonal, we can do some interesting things, and it's probably gonna, let's see, they just keep going here so you can see what they're doing. Okay, here's what I've done. I'm gonna erect a perpendicular to the diagonal. And this is how I'm doing it. You see this point right here? I've established this point because F is the same distance from A as B. So I'm not just arbitrarily imposing points. I'm using things that are already there. I then use A and F as centers, right? F is a center, and I swing this arc. A is a center, and I swing this arc, which gives me the point R. And the point R gives me that line, which bisects the base of the root 2 rectangle. Gives me a right angle there. And what's interesting about this, as you'll see here, is I created the first knowing pattern of dynamic symmetry. So I created a triangle there, right? That triangle has the same shape as that triangle. Exactly the same shape. That triangle. That triangle. That triangle. That triangle. They're all similar. They all have the same size, the same. In other words, as one is to this, and then that is to the next. So you end up with a series of harmonic triangles where there's a consistency, a constant proportionality to these things. And this is defined by the square root of 2. So now, when you have that perpendicular, what's interesting is it bisects the base of your rectangle, right? And if you use that, you can get consistency. A constant proportionality to these things, and this is defined by the square root of 2. So now, when you have that perpendicular, what's interesting is it bisects the base of your rectangle, right? And if you use that, you can get a harmonic whorl out of this, where each progression in the thing is defined by the root 2. So each one of these grows by the root 2 as it comes around like this. And this can begin to show you some of the symmetries that begin to appear in this particular rectangle. Now, when we take these crossing points right here, now notice, when you do these spirals, they never actually ever reach those points. You see, that's kind of like Zeno's paradox. It just will get closer and closer and closer, but will never actually get there, right? But nonetheless, these are dynamic points within this frame. So when I abstract it, and I've just got the 4 points, what's interesting about those is that you connect them, that rectangle exactly recapitulates the proportions of the original. And then we can put this in here, and what we're seeing is this particular line is creating 2 rectangles out of the original one. And both of those 2 rectangles are root 2 rectangles. So whatever the properties are you started with on the first one, they are carried over into this second generation here. Now I use the points again that are already there, like this, and I've created 4 rectangles. And they're all root 2 rectangles. So again, whatever properties are inherent in the original one, it's being carried over in each generation of this particular line. So each of these is a root 2 rectangle, just like the one I started with. So those properties are carried over. And if I begin to enter in more diagonals, and again, using the points that are already there, I can begin to subdivide this initial bifurcation can subdivide infinite. In other words, you can begin to take this template to whatever degree of precision you like. See, I can keep adding lines in here, and nowhere do I lose the original harmonic proportion of root 2. Now we get back to that, and we've already been through this, so we won't dwell on this. Square root of 1 is the square root of 1. Square root of 2, remember I took the diagonal of the root 2 rectangle. We discovered that it was the square root of 3. Now, if I do the same process again with the root 3 rectangle, project the base, project the top, I'm going to create a root 3 rectangle, and there it is. Now, you understand this. This is my exercise for erecting a perpendicular. So I get my perpendicular, and that perpendicular hits the base of my root 3 rectangle right there. What's special about that point? Well, once again, we're getting this harmonic series of triangles. But what's interesting here is it divides the base exactly into 1/3. So if I did it from the other side, I get 3 rectangles, and what are the proportions of those rectangles? Well, root 3 rectangles. Just exactly the proportions of the one I started with. So again, here's the harmonic geometry, and you can begin to see it's just a matter of entering diagonals and then using the points of crossing to generate more points, and then you can proceed to develop a template. And that's what they did, basically. They developed a template. And the template could be carried to whatever level of precision one preferred. And that's just to kind of demonstrate that there's this symmetry, the symmetry of the, and just very simple, just there are patterns within the patterns that you can see that, and all these are very simple, but they could all be generated out of this root 3 geometry. Really good. And then by just adding additional circles, you can create things that are known, flower of life, etc. And then this is the root 2 spacing ratio. This is where you stay consistently with a series of expanding nested circles and squares where the constant of proportionality is the square root of 2. There. And one of the places we find in nature, which to me is very fascinating, where we find nested root 2 circles, is in the great multi-ring impact structures. Who would have thought? But in fact, to astronomers who are looking at circular features on the moon and other planets and things that are trying to determine, is this a large impact or is this volcanic? Because volcanoes don't do this. Only impacts. Because what it does is it liquefies the surface, because the heat of the energy is so great, it liquefies the surface, and the rings are moving outward in molten rock, which then crystallizes, cools down as it's moving out, and then it crystallizes into rings that have the root 2 spacing ratio. So here's again Mare Orientale on the moon. Exactly displays the square root 2. So let's see what's going to happen here. You'll, at this point now, know that these 2 circles are related, because whatever the radius of this circle, multiply by the square root of 2 and you get the radius of that circle. And we know now that the square root of 2 is roughly 1.4, right? If you're using a calculator, I would just go 1.4142, or I'll just hit 2 and square root it, and then it'll give it to you, I don't know how many places, out 30 or 40 places or something. Now, we're going to go through an interesting sequence here to show you what I call the master metrological diagram. Because in the ancient world, the unit of measure that one started with was always critically important. It was referred, you could use the term modulus, the modulus of the plan, right? And this could apply to any composed work, right? The modulus. You start with some unit, some basic fundamental unit that the whole thing is built upon. In sacred architecture, that unit was almost invariably derived from the earth and generally derived from its geographic position on the earth, right? And it would usually be some function of the earth's radii, right? And it would be beyond what we're going to be able to talk about tonight, but in the classes that I would do regularly in the old days, we got into that in great detail, how those principles will work and how they could potentially be reused again today. But now notice what I'm doing here. Check this out. Here's the square, right? Here's its diagonal. That diagonal gives you this circle. That circle then gives you this root 2 rectangle, right? Can you see it? Now we take the diagonal of the root 2 rectangle, and what do you think we're going to do with that? Well, we draw another circle. And that circle, then from that circle, we can generate the points to get that square. And then look what happens. We have this point. So we've got a center, and we've got that point, and I can connect those points. So what I have now, think of this. This is our initial unit, right? We're calling it 1. But you know that 1 is the square root of itself, right? So we're going to call this root 1. This becomes root 2. This becomes root 3. What do you think this one becomes? So take a guess. Root 1, root 2, root 3, root 4. Yes. Root 4. By the same simple Pythagorean theorem, right? 1 squared plus the square root of 3 squared. Square root of 3 times square root of 3 is 3. 3 plus 1 is 4. There you go. Now you've got a length that's double the length you started with. Now notice we've sort of returned back to rationality, because square root of 2, square root of 3 are these weird numbers that go on forever, but now we get back, square root of 4 is just 2. So now what we've got is the potential to create a double square. So I'm going to do that. Boom. So, I know it's getting hard to read, but here's our initial square. Here's the second square now that's going to be the same size as the first one. So we now have here a double square. Think about this, double square, 1, 4, what do you think the diagonal is going to be? Square root of 5, isn't it? Right? So, we've got square root of 1, square root of 2, square root of 3, square root of 4, square root of 5. Now, square root of 5 is valuable and important because here was another one of the geometric sequence. The square root of 5 was how you got to the golden section. See? How many of you have heard of the golden section? This form of the divine proportion. Other names, right? Who knows what it is? Who could actually tell me what is the divine proportion? And how dare you live on this earth as a human being, the walking embodiment of the divine proportion, and you don't know what it is?
The first two, the sum of the first two would equal the sum. So we do like 1 and 1 is 2, and 2 is 3, 2 and 3 is 5, and 5 is 8.
What's your name?
Rusty.
Rusty is talking about the Fibonacci sequence, which is where you have a sequence of numbers where each number, each value in that sequence is the sum of the two that came before it. So it goes 0, 1, 0 plus 1 is 1, so 1 is the next number, 1 plus 1 is 2, 2 plus 1 is 3, 3 plus 2 is 5, 5 plus 3 is 8, right? 8 plus 5 is 13, 13 plus 8 is 21, 21 plus 13 is 34, 34 plus 21 is 55, etc., etc. Now what's happening is you're getting a sequence there that converges on a certain number as a limit, but it never actually gets there. It's one of those cases again. That limit is a divine proportion. And the bigger the numbers you use, to get your initial ratio, the closer you're going to get to whatever that value is, which is like 1.61803399 dot, right? Generally, you don't need to go that far. You can stop, a lot of people will use it and stop at 1.6. I like to get a little more precise than that because I use geometry and I can, even though, and here's what's interesting, even though numerically you cannot actually represent it with precision, geometrically you can, see? You can find that point. Think of it this way. Here's a line. Let's say I take this line, and I want to divide this line. If I divide it in the middle, then the two pieces I've got are exactly equal to each other. And that's a static situation. That's not dynamic, right? If I start moving the point at which I'm going to cut this off of the middle, then obviously the two sizes, the two lengths are going to be different, right? They could go one could be very long, one could be very short. They could be, close to the same, but not quite the same. But there's only one point where I could cut that, right? Where the ratio of the small section is to the large section, as the large section was to the whole original length, right? So picture this. Picture an arc, an arc, and an arc. And that's the golden section. Now, how does that apply to a human? Well, typically in my classes, we will do a demonstration. We'll do a little statistical analysis, right? If you stand somebody up, can I have a volunteer, Cameron? Oh, Cameron, don't, you're a lot prettier than you think you are, Cameron. I mean, doesn't everybody agree that Cameron's really quite pretty? Okay. Well, if we take any person, right, and take their height. Now let's go to that asymmetrical division again, right? And if I were to actually find that golden section point of this particular length, and there's only one point where it works, and I were to now expand it to a fluid's height, that divine point right there would be her navel, the point of her generation as a human being. Now, when she was born, her navel was not in the golden section. It was halfway. See, think about this. If you saw somebody walking down the street that had the proportions of a 3-month-old infant, you would think they were strange looking. Likewise, if you saw an infant that had the proportions of a grown adult, you would think they're strange looking, right? What happens is, as you grow into a whole series of golden section relationships. What about your arm up here? Now, if we take, here's another video. This is the fluid's cube of her elbow to her fingertips, right? Cubit, and that's how it's defined. Cubitis, Latin for elbow, actually, right? If I take this length here and I divide it by the golden section, there's a space right here. You feel on your wrist right now. Feel on your wrist. You'll find a hollow space on your wrist called the space of desktop. Feel around and see if you can find a hollow place on your wrist. Is there anybody in here who does not have one? Because that's one of the diagnostic criteria for identifying aliens. If you don't have that. Okay, so guess what? There it is, the golden section relationship from the fingertip to that wrist joint space of desktop to her elbow, right? Also, if I were to take a rectangle, short side 1, the long side 1.618, the golden section, that would be a rectangle. See, that would frame the face. And then I could begin dividing that, and I would get the positions of all the features. I could go, thank you. Normally for that demonstration, I have the person take all their clothes off, but in this case, for the interest of time, it's much more effective that way. Okay, now you see what I'm doing here. Look what's happening. I'm just going to keep this progression going. You can see root 1, root 2, root 3, root 4, root 5. What do you think this square root is? 6. Now, again, root 5, root 6, they're rational numbers. Root 2, root 3 are rational numbers. Root 4 is not. So right in the middle of this sequence, we get this sort of return to rationality, which I kind of find rather interesting. So here's all the root ratios. They're incommensurable in length. You see, other than the root 4, which is 2. What do I mean by that? Well, it means that if you take a number, or you take some whole number, 1 foot, let's say, I use 1 foot. If I multiply it by the square root of 2, well, I'm going to get 16.97 dot, 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 dot. Now, most builders in the field know this. They don't know that, but they do know that if they round it off to 17, that's going to be good enough for most work in the field. So you think of this, if you've got a square foot, side is going to be 12 inches. Think of its diagonal as 17 inches. And 17 to 12 is going to be very close to the root 2, but it's obviously not going to be precisely out. But it's close enough, right? Because we're human beings and none of us are perfect. So here I put all those diagonals in yellow. There they are. So you've got this whole series of harmonic relationships here. And just to see some of the symmetry that's in there. Now, what's interesting about all of this is that from that, I call that the master pattern, the master diagram. Because from that was derived the ancient system of sacred metrology. It was the system used to build sacred structures all over the ancient world. Mayamata said, if the measurement of the temple is in every way perfect, there will be perfection in the universe as well. Now, when you look at that, you think, what we're talking about here is the principle of reciprocity, meaning that what humans do, our actions can feed back into a higher scheme of things. Now, this is one of the animating concepts of the ancient world, was that our actions would resonate on levels far beyond the normal scale of human influence, if the proper geometries were employed. Because, you see, the thing is that we're dealing with this material world as simply patterns of intersecting frequencies. And they vibrate at ratios that turn out to be the ratios we're looking at right here. And this is where it becomes very significant. And I'm going to speed through some of this. But some of the I've just gone not. I'm not trying to indoctrinate anybody into Christianity, but there is a whole, shall we say, a substratum of Christian belief that most Christians today have no idea is even there. There is a geometric basis to the Bible, just as there is to the Vedas. Just as there is to the Tao Te Ching, right? It's there in the sacred writings. There is a substratum of geometry. And that's something I say for advanced classes, but it really becomes the means of decoding a lot of these cryptic utterances that we've inherited from the ancient world. I lifted up my eyes again and looked, and behold, a man with a measuring line in his hand. Then said I, whither goest thou? And he said unto me, to measure Jerusalem, to see what is the breadth thereof and what is the length thereof. Who is this guy? He's got a measuring line in his hand, and he's going to measure the holy city. In this case, you've got to understand that the holy city is a metaphor, essentially, for something else. It's the universal template or plan for the temple. Think about the word template. Think about the word temple. Think about the word temporal, which means time, because the sacred edifices, the temples, were slices of time frozen into stone, frozen into wood, momentarily. So you would capture a moment of time. It could be the solstice sunrise coming, right? That moment of time when you realize, yes, the light is coming back after 3 or 4 days or 5 days of darkness. The light is coming back. But it went much further than that, because I believe what the ancient peoples understood was we live on a thin veneer. We've created our cultures on this thin veneer, above which and below which are just inconceivably powerful, tremendous forces. And only as long as those forces stay in this delicate balance can this all endure. You could begin to shift the parameters ever so slightly, and the whole confluence of things that makes all this possible would get out of phase and it would disappear. Just think of this. If you create Earth with too much more mass, what happens? We would have never evolved beyond slugs, right? If you have too little mass, everything flies into space. If you're too close to the sun, you burn up. If you're too far away, it would be perpetual ice. So it's a very narrow range that makes all of this possible. And see, I think the ancient people understood that. And they understood that forces, think about what's been going on in the last few months. We've had 4 volcanoes erupting, right? How many of those? Kilauea has been erupting, the big eruption in Guatemala. See, these things, most people just look at these and think they're just arbitrarily random. They're not. They're not. You see, there are patterns unfolding in time. And the way to understand those patterns is to understand that those patterns are governed by the same numbers that we find inherent in this geometry. See, the great year of the world was a model. It was a model of taking our small annual trip around the sun and projecting it to the next level and understanding that on that level were the events that happened that allowed whole ecosystems to rise and thrive and perish or to suddenly become extinct, or for cities and cultures and civilizations to rise and suddenly become extinct, you see? And that has happened. See, that's the legacy. This is what, like, the work of Graham Hancock is so vitally important right now, because what he's doing is he's documenting and showing that, yes, the history of our species on this planet is much deeper, richer, and more complex than anybody had even imagined. And it's very likely that there have been whole worlds that have preceded the one we're doing right now, the one that we're creating right now, that have disappeared. And this is an idea that is not favored by a lot of, shall we say, mainstream scholars and mainstream scientists, and most of them who are dismissive of that idea have never actually looked. How many of you guys actually, did anybody here catch the debate I did on the Joe Rogan show? Several of you. You can find that online. It's worth going. The editor and publisher of Skeptic magazine challenged myself and Graham Hancock to a debate. It's been one of the most listened to debates probably ever, literally. I'm not trying to toot my horn, but right, I mean, it's up in the millions. Probably no debate has 8 to 10 million. So, I mean, it's probably one of the most listened to debates ever in history, right? I mean, when you think of it that way. But anyways, it's worth listening to, because the skeptic didn't fare too well. I'm pleased to say. I'm pleased to report it. At least this was more or less the consensus. What?
I concur.
He concurs, and he heard it, he concurs.
He was exposed.
Well, you see, but he represents, see, the thing about him, he's a figurehead. He represents a whole realm of academia that basically wants to suppress certain ideas. And why that is would be a whole topic of another discussion. But some of the ideas being proposed here are very politically incorrect right now for a number of reasons, which I won't get into here tonight because we're running out of time. From the book of Revelation, and there was given me a reed like unto a rod. This is the rod, right? And typically they would use straight reeds, and oftentimes they would be marked. And you would use that. If I set this up on the horizon and somebody else has a sighting pole, typically with a circle with a cross in it, there's, picture that, the circle with the cross. You sight through that, and then somebody else with a sighting rod. What I would do is I would look through and I would line this crosshair up with a star rising on the horizon, and the second figure would then have a second pole and rise, and I would indicate to where he stops. So now I have an alignment to that particular point on the horizon. And that was typically the universal method that was used. So, the angel, first, you notice in the last, when it was a man, now it's an angel. The angel stood, saying, "Rise and measure the temple of God, and the altar, and them that worship therein." Why? Because then what you'll find out is that the temple, the altar, and the worshipers in it all have a constant of proportionality that links them together. But then it goes beyond that, and the temple itself now has a geometrical relationship with the earth itself. And that geometrical relationship is derived from where on the earth it's put. Because the earth is not a perfect sphere, it's an oblate spheroid. So that means that if you move from the equator to the North Pole, the latitude of the earth is shrinking. In fact, if you go from the equator and you were to travel to the North Pole, you would actually be 13 miles closer to the Earth's center of gravity at the North Pole or the South Pole than you would at the equator. See, this factor was incorporated into their modulus that was used to build their temples. And again, this is advanced stuff, so beyond what we can talk about tonight. But it's a very robust idea that they did this, because we can find temples and buildings all over the place where, if you analyze them according to where they are positioned on the Earth, you can then reverse engineer it back to what the original module was. Which suggests that, you know, people in the distant past knew how to measure the Earth. But that's the one thing right there carries pretty significant implications. Why would hunter-gatherers be interested in measuring the size of the Earth? or even the shape of the Earth. Because you see, the thing is to know the difference in the modulus as it changes, depending on where you are latitudinally, that means you understand the shape of the Earth. Now that's pretty sophisticated stuff, you know, that hunter-gatherers weren't supposed to know that, were they? So now we'll go into a brief thing on historic metrology, and then we're going to wrap it up as soon as you can get all of this in your brain. I'm going back to one of the original units, one of those modules that was used by the ancient Egyptians. It was called the Riemann, an Egyptian unit of linear measurement analyzed by F.H. Griffin in 1892 and by William Flinders Petrie and A.E. Behrman, considered to be equal to 20 digits or 14.58 inches. A.E. Behrman in his historical metrology defined the length of the Riemann to 1.2165. You don't need to remember those numbers. I just want you to remember the relationships. The royal cubit. Okay, the royal cubit was the used to build many of the temples, including, presumably, the pyramid of Cheops on the Giza Plateau, and it was 1.72 or 20.625. Well, here's what's interesting. If you take these two, the Riemann, 14.58, and the royal cubit is the square root of 2 times the Riemann. So if you drew one square Riemann on the ground and drew its diagonal, that was the royal cubit. See? Then there was a Palestinian cubit that showed up a couple of thousand years later, which was the cubit in a hand's breadth of Ezekiel. This was the ground plan of the sacred the Jewish temple, right? Conforms to the cubit of the altar mentioned in Ezekiel 43:13. That is the cubit in a hand breadth. The Palestinian cubit is generally taken as 25.284 or 2.17 feet. Well, now we're talking about being used in the Palestine area. We're talking about between roughly 0 BC and 1000 BC, right? Now, if you take the Riemann and you multiply it by the square root of 3, what do you get? You get the Palestinian cubit. So now you've got Riemann, royal cubit, Palestinian cubit following this progression. Then we go to the Roman pace, which they used to lay out their cities and their temples and so on. The Roman pace, you know how the pace was. If you generally you will count every other footstep is a pace, right? Because if you're pacing off something, you don't want to count every step. Make it easier. Count every time, say, your right foot hits the ground, right? Well, in all of the ancient concepts, 1,000 paces, what's the Latin word for pace? I mean, what's the Latin word for 1,000? Mil, right? So where we get our word mile. Mile was based upon 1,000 human paces. In this case, this was the Romans. So if you look at their double pace was 4.86, so they standardized that. The half pace was 2.43, right? So this is what, you heard that all roads lead to Rome, right? And because they had the pillar at the center of the city, and everything was marked out from that vertical line, right? So you've got the Roman pace. Well, do you think that has any relation to the Riemann? It certainly does. It's double the Riemann. So now we've got the square root of 1, square root of 2, square root of 2, square root of 4. In Egyptian and Palestinian, now Roman measurements. And then Alexander Thumb, who, as it says here, in the 1960s and 1970s, surveyed and analyzed over 500 megalithic remains and stone circles throughout the British Isles. The megalithic yard was determined by Thumb to be equal to 2.72 feet. Well, guess what? Here we go. Here is the sequence. Megalithic yard is the Riemann times the square root of 5. So there, as these ancient Britons, 4,000, 5,000 years ago, are laying out all these standing stone circles, they're using a unit of measurement that is harmonically related to what the Egyptians were building with. You see? Coincidence? And then, of course, Riemann times 6 is almost our modern yard of 3 feet. It's a little bit off. But, so what that means then is when you go back to this diagram, all of those measurements are all unified by this diagram. Now, this is just the outer surface of this whole system. There are others in here. I've got Sumerian feet, Assyrian feet. There's others. You see, what I'm showing here, and again, we're just blasting through this quickly, is that I'm presenting evidence that the ancient world had a unified system of metrology. And it's a unified system of metrology we use consistently to construct sacred structures, to build the temples and to build cathedrals, whatever the case may be, to put up standing stone circles. See? Now, if this is true, and it gets hard to dismiss this coincidence, in my opinion. If there is a unified system of metrology based upon this harmonic geometry, where did it come from? And how is it that all these ancient cultures around the world, and we didn't even get into the Mayan stuff, we could get into that, and you'd see what they were doing was part of the same system. Where did it come from? Was it diffused from some center? Did everybody come up with it independently? It raises a mystery about our own evolution as a culture. 15 minutes? So, now here's where that also gets interesting. Because we're talking about lengths that are incommensurable, right? Square root of 2, square root of 3, square root of 4. None of if you set them up as ratios, that is as fractions, you can have a whole number in either numerator or denominator, but not the other one, right? Meaning they're irrational. However, if you go from lengths to areas, they suddenly become perfectly commensurable. So, in other words, 1 square royal cubit was equal to 2 square remans. Now, I might mention that the human association with this was right here. Upper arm was the reman, and the forearm was the cubit. Right, so now, from now on, whenever you see anybody saluting, let that remind you, reman and royal cubit, and this is the diagonal of the square whose side is your upper arm. Okay. 1 square Palestinian cubit is equal to 3 Egyptian square units perfectly. 1 square Roman pace equal to 4 square Egyptian cubits. Now, so 1 megalithic yard equal to 5. Perfectly expressed by commensurable whole numbers. And 1 virtual modern yard is equal to 6 square remans. So the idea here is that you could actually integrate these numbers when you think about this, when you're moving up from one dimension, you're moving up a dimension, you see, from length to area. Now, what really gets interesting is you move the next dimension from area to volume. But that's beyond what we can do tonight, because I think we're getting close to the end here.
Randall?
Yes.
How about we show how this has percolated up through different specific architectures and artwork?
Okay, well, we can just do some quick examples here. Let's see what we got here. One of the most prominent ways in recent history was in the great cathedral building era of the Middle Ages. How many of you have ever been to Europe and been to some of the great cathedrals? Yeah, then you know what I'm talking about. This is ambiance. This is one. We'll go through these really quick. All of this is geometry, and I could show you if we had more time how they used the system that we're actually been talking about here. The square gave, in the root 2 relationships, gave rise to a system called ad quadratum, or of the square. The root 3, which was related to the equilateral triangle, gave the ad triangulum system, which was based upon the equilateral triangle. This particular vault is actually based upon pentagonal geometry. Chartres Cathedral. If there's any one cathedral that is just saturated with symbolism, it's this one. And some of that symbolism is pretty powerful stuff. It has been called the Golden Book of the West. Here is the ground plan of that cathedral. Now check this out. You see, the length-width ratio is not arbitrary. Length, width, it's the basic into root 3, which of course makes great symbolic sense because this was dedicated to the Virgin, right? The ultimate woman who's about to give birth to a god. And of course, this is not exclusively limited to the Christian tradition because we find it repeated over and over and over again universally. But there it is. And again, this is no accident. And here's St. Mary's Chapel. Again, St. Mary's Chapel of Glastonbury. Now, what's the significance of Glastonbury? Well, because Glastonbury, for a time, is considered to be the repository and hiding place of the Holy Grail. How many of you have heard the story of the Holy Grail? How many of you have seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail? Okay, well, we should watch that as a class project sometime. Why not? See, actually, there was some interesting esoterica hidden in there. And those guys were pretty well learned in some things. But actually, you know, the movie by, what was his name? In 1980, I believe, Excalibur. is a telling of Thomas Mallory's version of the Grail legends.
John Borman.
Borman, yeah, thank you, John Borman. Right. So anyways, not to get off on that sidetrack, here's St. Mary's Chapel. There's an interesting story behind this. During the early 20th century, the Church of England hired an architect by the name of Bly Bond to excavate the ruins of the grounds here around this chapel, which used to be part of Glastonbury Abbey. And he was looking for a particular extension of the main abbey that I think now it's called Edward's Abbey, and he couldn't find it. And he met up with this guy named William Simcox Lee, who was a reverend who also did automatic writing. So unbeknownst to the ecclesiastical authorities that had hired them, they engaged in an exercise of automatic writing with Simcox Lee being, going into a trance, writing this. And what they claim happened was that one of the medieval monks came through and started telling him where to dig. Well, whether the story is true or not, the fact is that they did go dig, and the writings actually exist, right? They do exist, right? Where they were told to go and dig, they went and dug there. Bly Bond dug there, and lo and behold, he found this chapel. Somehow, I don't remember the details of the story, but somehow the authorities found out about it, and when they did, he was let go. There are other reasons as well, and it had to do with the symbolic significance of this thing that was turned out to be very politically incorrect today. Again, that's something that I get into in other classes. But here is the ground plan of St. Mary's Chapel. It's
bicep curl.
68.6 divided by 39.6. Try the math on that, pull your calculators out, do the math to discover that's a root 3 rectangle.
Exercise.
Then we have the Palazzo Farnese in Rome. It's based upon the root 2
That's what I was doing at
relationships,
the
and I'm
end
going to
there,
go through
the
this
calves.
quick.
Going up and down on the calves.
Stonehenge.
I ended up doing 100 lifts. I
Let's
was
see here.
careful not to do them all in a row because you can cramp, but
here's all the numbers.
being here.
It's
I am
almost like
gonna
a whole
sign off,
class just to analyze these particular numbers. But I'll show you some. The
I am going to sign off.
Pylons fit perfectly into golden rectangles. There's a whole geometry template that was laid out on the ground to establish the design of the temple, and it's all based upon harmonic geometry and the squaring of the solution of the squaring of the circle, which was considered to be like the ultimate problem of geometry, because there is no way to exactly square the circle. See, the idea was to get as close as possible, right? Because the square was considered to be emblematic of all things material, all things measurable, all things finite. The circle was considered to be emblematic of all things immeasurable, the infinite, the irrational as opposed to the rational.
Thank you for
right?
being here.
So the squaring of the circle was reconciling these opposing tendencies symbolized by the square and the circle.
I'm going to read
If you could
something
do that,
perfect dark.
you would accomplish harmony.
If that's
That
okay.
was the idea. This is the perfect solution, almost perfect solution for the squaring of the circle, built into the ground plan of Stonehenge. And here at the same scale in St. Mary's Chapel,
Oh, if I think so.
superimposed upon that of
Stubby Rose,
Stonehenge,
Stubby Rose.
and there's the root 3 rectangle. And I do
Yeah,
this to
Stubby
show
Rose.
just one example of many, many, many,
Thanks for being
where
here.
you could show that the same system of design and architecture was being used throughout the ages.
No, let's do
Which raises some very interesting questions about how was it perpetuated? Was it perpetuated in an unbroken lineage?
He
Was
is
it
a
lost and
Mr.
then
Blonde's Revenge
rediscovered?
world
I
record
don't
holder
know.
on the
But in our own
XBLA
time,
on
I
Xbox.
suspect it's been lost.
Perfect
Probably
Dark.
lost going into
Cool
the
guy.
early 20th century, and various historical reasons I could put
Oh,
forth
wait,
to
thank you
that.
for being here.
But I
should
now
work
think
out.
that we're
I
in a
was speedrun
phase where
Golden
it's
Knights,
being
so I might get on later
rediscovered,
tonight.
and that
Speedrunning.
we can begin to take these virtuals,
On
and I
N64.
barely scratched the surface of this, the whole system,
Wait.
because it gets, again, the whole astronomical level, it gets into
Flex
the
the end.
geometric level, and knowing and understanding the confluence of forces in the lithosphere. Because you have to understand that this planet is constantly pulsing. You know that there's tides, right? The lunar tides, right? Well, there's also tides in the solid lithosphere of the Earth itself. And those tides are predominantly lunar, but they're also solar and they're also planetary, which also can have very small effects that only at the right times can be significant. See, now